Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. In 2018, the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department conducted an internal audit of its Force Investigative Unit, which was created in 2013 to investigate police shootings. What we know is that the audit was sharply critical of the unit's performance, and it found problems in each of the unit's 50 investigations up to that point. We also know what some of those problems were: officers not being interviewed, warrants delayed, a report that needed 146 corrections months later. But these sorts of problems are just the tip of this iceberg. What it boils down to is this: we don't know much about St. Louis's Force Investigative Unit, and we've got little insight into its faults because even 6 years after its completion, no one outside the police department has ever seen the 2018 audit in full. Last week, St. Louis Post-Dispatch columnist Tony Messenger published his own lengthy investigation into the audit, and he joins us now to discuss that work, including why the audit's been kept secret so long. Tony, welcome back to St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks for having me, Elaine. Good to see you.
So let's start with the beginning. What is the Force Investigative Unit, and where did it come from?
So it was created, at least at the beginning, in 2013 when Sam Dotson was the police chief and Francis Slay was the mayor. It had actually been conceived in a study from UMSL Professor David Klinger and Dan Isom, the former chief before Sam Dotson. And the idea was that there are frequently problems when there is a police shooting, particularly in the black community, in which the community doesn't trust that the criminal justice system is properly investigating the police as to whether or not procedures were followed, that there was a good, honest, fair, transparent investigation. So the idea behind the unit was police were going to have a separate, independent unit that was going to investigate every time there was a police shooting.
Mm-hmm. And was that in line with what was happening around the country as well?
Well, there are a variety of different ways. Mr. Klinger, the professor from UMSL, basically advised the city that this is the best practice, having an independent unit as compared to just regular homicide detectives investigating every time there's a police shooting. Mm-hmm. And so it was within sort of best practices within the policing community nationwide. And that unit really didn't get its start until 2014 when they staffed it up. And it really became a prominent unit in 2014 after the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, because then following that, there were some very high-profile police shootings and killings of black men in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And so that unit became very prolific and very much in the news in 2014, 2015, 16, 17, et cetera.
Right. Now, in general, what is it that happens when a police officer uses force?
Well, that's a good question, because the origination of the Force Investigative Unit, part of what former Chief Dotson talked about, and the unit's first director, Roger Engelhardt, who was a lieutenant at the time, talked about, was that the whole purpose was for there to be transparency so that the community could trust, hey, you know what, when the police tell us and when the prosecutor tells us that this was a reasonable shooting, that the person had a gun and was pointing at police officers or firing at police officers or whatever the circumstance is, those reports were supposed to be published. And in fact, 3 of them early on, 3 shootings that a lot of longtime St. Louisans will remember, the death of Kajimi Powell, of Mansur Balbay, and Von Derrick Myers. Those reports were all made public. 2 of them are still on the St. Louis Post-Dispatch website as we speak. That was the purpose, so that the community can read the report, find out who was investigated, find out what they had to say, and make a reasonable judgment that, hey, the police did a good job here, or the police didn't do a good job here, and we want to see the prosecutor do something.
Mm-hmm. So, we will talk about those cases that you've just named and the reports a little bit later. We want to invite those of you who are listening into this conversation. Do you have a question or a comment about the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department's Force Investigative Unit, or how officer-involved shootings are investigated? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or you can send us a tweet at STL On Air or email us at talk@stlpr.org. So this the federal or the Force Investigative Unit, there are a lot of Fs here.
Yeah, a lot of Fs.
When should it be coming into play, and what do we know about how it's not being brought into the process of looking into what has happened when an officer has shot someone?
So every time there is a police officer in St. Louis discharges their weapon, that's supposed to trigger FIU doing its own investigation. And we know that based on the report that I obtained from a source and reported on in the Post-Dispatch, we know that there had been 50 of those investigations between 2014 and 2018. What we don't know is what most of those investigations found, because other than those first 3 that were made public, the police department at some point changed its philosophy, and they are not producing final investigative reports for the public on those shootings. And so we don't know what they found. We don't know the full extent of those investigations. All we know ultimately is whether or not any charges have been brought, and there have been very few charges brought on police shootings in the last several years.
And just to clarify, it is police shootings, not other uses of force that are investigated?
Correct. It's got to be a discharge of a weapon.
Okay. Now, the Force Investigative Unit, what it's supposed to do, how does it go about figuring out whether any given use of force was warranted or not?
Well, ultimately, at least as it was conceived, the report that they produce is supposed to go to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor is supposed to decide. The Force Investigative Unit, at least as it was explained in its onset, was supposed to produce a neutral report. It's not going to say, hey, you need to charge so-and-so on this. Hey, this was a good shooting or a bad shooting. It's supposed to do an investigation, produce all the facts, give it to the prosecutor, and let the prosecutor decide. And then produce that report to the public so that the public can have some transparency. This is the major problem that I found with the Force Investigative Unit. First of all, there's been no transparency in terms of the reports becoming available to the public. And secondly, the fact that they investigated themselves and found multiple problems with the Force Investigative Unit investigations and then tried to keep that audit secret, that was really offensive to me, because now you have information for the public that says, oh, by the way, our investigation of police shootings have been really bad and really shoddy, and we haven't done a very good job, but we're not going to bother telling you that. And in fact, when it gets discussed in public court cases, when a reporter like me files a sunshine law request, we're going to keep that information from you, and we're not going to explain it. The police have offered no explanation whatsoever for their belief of what's in this audit, what it says, or why they want to keep it secret.
We have Melanie, who is calling from Maryland Heights. Melanie, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, good afternoon. Happy February 1st.
Yes, same to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my question was, what happens after these investigations where you have found that some of these officers who have been investigated have in fact been found to have used excessive force? Are they just let go of the force, or are they, just given a slap on the wrist and allowed to rejoin? Are they, dismissed for a certain period of time? And because, the community doesn't necessarily know about these internal investigations that have gone on, and we would like to know how the St. Louis Police Department or St. Louis County Police Department has dealt with these officers who have used excessive force that the community no longer trusts.
Mm-hmm. Melanie, thank you so much.
Well, I mean, I can tell you, Melanie, that in the city, and that's what this investigation was specifically the city's police department, there is very little transparency. So, for instance, my investigation found that the former head of the Force Investigative Unit, a gentleman named Roger Engelhardt, was fired. The police department didn't tell anybody that he was fired. There was no public information, no public reporting on when he was fired back in 2021. He was fired because of this report, which was made available in 2018. Not fired for 3 years later. And one of the things that's fascinating that I found in court records is that Mr. Engelhardt himself would like a copy of this report that says he did such a bad job,
sure.
So that he can defend himself, because he's actually involved in 2 different court processes to try to get his job back, and he hasn't seen the full report either, and so that lack of transparency says to the members of the public, we're not going to tell you when there's a problem with our policing. And that doesn't do anything to increase trust in the police department.
Mm-hmm. We also have Ron, who is calling from Ferguson with a comment. Ron, welcome to St. Louis on the Air. Hi, Ron. Perhaps we've lost him. Well, something that I want to ask about has to do with whether police officers are required to talk to Force Investigative Unit representatives. Does this unit have that power?
Well, this is one of the interesting things about this audit. The police department said that I couldn't have the audit because it's a personnel record. And yet the police department also says in other court records that they were investigating Mr. Engelhardt in a criminal investigation. And it's important within the context of how police are investigated that there are different rules for whether or not they're being investigated for alleged criminal activity, mm-hmm. or whether or not they are investigated in a personnel matter. If it's a purely personnel matter and internal affairs comes to a police official and says, we're investigating you for department malfeasance, there is a rule called the Garrity Rule that says police officers have to tell the truth to internal affairs, but that their statements made to internal affairs in a personnel investigation can't be used against them in a criminal investigation. It's an incentive for police officers to tell the truth and for the police department to then be able to clean up any issues and say, okay, you violated these issues. Next time, pull your taser out instead of your gun, or whatever the departmental rule might be. But when there is confusion, as there is in this case related to the audit of the Force Investigative Unit, where there's clear sharing between personnel records and an alleged criminal investigation, it's hard to determine whether or not, one, Mr. Engelhardt's rights were protected or violated, or two, what's the actual nature of this investigation? Is it an audit? Is it a personnel record? Is it a criminal investigation? We know from court records that Lieutenant Colonel Michael Sack turned over the contents of the FIU audit to the FBI. And so in that context, it's a criminal investigation. And that's what really bothers me about the fact that the police department and the mayoral administration has done everything they can to keep this criminal investigation of their own unit mm-hmm. out of the public's eye.
We're going to pause, but we will be back very shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. Before the break, you mentioned the name Roger Engelhardt a number of times. Tony, tell us, who is Lieutenant Roger Engelhardt?
So he was the first director of the Force Investigative Unit. He was appointed to the job by former Chief Dotson in 2013. Engelhardt was a sergeant at the time. He later got promoted to lieutenant, and he ran the unit from 2013 through 2018. Mm-hmm. He's a 30-year veteran of the St. Louis Police Department. Folks in the community might know of him if they've paid attention to the Guns and Hoses nonprofit boxing event that's held as a fundraiser for Backstoppers every year. Lieutenant Engelhardt was really active in that program. He was a boxer when he was younger. He's still likes to, do that sort of thing. So he was fired in 2021, and he was fired as a result of this audit that was completed in 2018. Mm-hmm. Among the things that the audit accuses Lieutenant Engelhardt of doing is double dipping. So a lot of police officers work secondary employment, working, right. Security for private firms, for corporations, for the Cardinals games, all of those sorts of things. And Mr. Engelhardt did all of those sorts of things, and he was accused in the audit of getting paid by the police department during some of the same hours that he was also allegedly getting paid by private employers. Mm-hmm. It's been an issue, actually, in the police department for years. A state audit several years ago pointed to lack of record keeping as it relates to secondary employment in the department. Mm-hmm. That's allegedly why he was fired, related to this audit. But this audit doesn't just get into his double dipping. This audit gets into details of all of the investigations that he oversaw. And so after he was fired, Mr. Engelhardt received unemployment for a while. And then the city, when they found out he was getting unemployment, said, no, we fired you. You can't get unemployment. And so they filed a motion to try to get the unemployment overturned. That's where a lot of the documentation about what the FIU audit came from, is court records from that case back and forth where Lieutenant Engelhardt and the police department were fighting over his unemployment. But the other significant thing about how this FIU audit came to be is that another police officer, former police officer, Milton Green, mm-hmm. he's the black police officer who was shot by a white police officer while Milton Green was off duty and trying to help in a police chase. Famous case, lots of people might remember that. Well, he's suing the department for failure to ultimately, take care of him after he got shot in the line of duty, basically. And in that lawsuit, the attorneys for Mr. Green asked Roger Engelhardt to sit for a deposition, and he did. And he told them about the FIU audit because he was trying to get it at the same time. And in that deposition, that's when the attorneys for Milton Green first found out about the audit, and they were furious mm-hmm. because, as your listeners, I'm sure many of them know, in a civil lawsuit case, there's discovery back and forth where the city has to share whatever documents they have. And the attorneys for Mr. Green had asked for all sorts of documents related to the Force Investigative Unit, and this audit would have been one of those documents. They didn't know about the audit specifically, but it should have been provided by the city, and it wasn't. Mm-hmm. Well, eventually, once they found out about it, the city provided it, but they provided it under seal. And I happened to be in court one day during one of those hearings in the Milton Green case where the FIU audit got mentioned. And as soon as it got mentioned, the city councilor's office stood up and said, "Whoa, Judge, we can't talk about this publicly. We've got to go have a private conversation." And they went and had a sidebar with the judge, and then they stopped talking about the FIU audit. That's when I first asked the city for it.
You were in the right place at the right time then.
Yeah, and this was a year ago. I filed a sunshine law request about a year ago for that audit, and the city said, "Nope, can't have it."
Before we came into the studio, I had asked you what response has been to this investigative piece.
Well, the response I'm getting is interesting because it's from two different camps that don't always necessarily get along. I've heard from a lot of police officers who are very upset that the city's keeping it private. Police officers don't like it when the city keeps secrets because it doesn't help them do their job better. And so they're upset at the city over the lack of transparency. So are the members of the black community and the protest community who were on the streets when those shootings were taking place, going back to Michael Brown and Mansour Balbay and Von Derritt Myers and et cetera, because one of the things they were asking for is, look, we don't trust when a young black person gets shot by police that you're doing a good investigation. And now they find out that for 6 years, the city has known that some of those investigations were really poor, or at least the city believes they do in an audit, and they're keeping it secret. So basically, the input I'm receiving is everybody's pretty upset that the city thinks that it's okay to keep this audit secret.
Yeah. So to the point of the audit, there is some information that you've been able to glean. What is in it, and what's in the portions that you've been able to obtain?
The portions that I've been able to obtain, and the reason I'm careful about saying that I don't know that I have the entire audit is because in court records there are some references to a number of pages, that the audit is X number of pages, and I don't have the number of pages that equal the same amount of pages that are mentioned in federal court records. So I can't be sure that I have a full portion of the audit. But basically, it's got two sections, and it's got a section that criticizes Lieutenant Englehart for his alleged double dipping and violations of procedure and possible criminal activity as it relates to basically stealing taxpayer dollars by double dipping. Mm-hmm. And then there's a section in which all 50 investigations that took place while Lieutenant Englehart was in charge of that unit are discussed in some capacity, and there are critical comments made on each of them. And some of them relate to questions over evidence that was or wasn't collected, questions over why somebody was or wasn't interviewed, questions about the delays and whether or not Lieutenant Englehart was actually paying attention to the investigations and moving them through in a timely fashion. There are lots of critical comments. None of them are related to Mr. Englehart doing anything that's fraudulent related to the covering up any sort of shootings, but there are just questions about whether or not the investigations were shoddy and questions about whether or not the public can trust that they were good investigations. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. And very briefly, we talked earlier about the 3 reports that have ever been released. Why is it that we've only seen 3?
Because at some point the police department changed their mind and said, we're not going to be a transparent department anymore as it relates to these investigations. And I don't know why, because I've asked them to make somebody available to discuss that, and the police department refuses to discuss the audit and how they've changed how the force investigation unit is run, and so has the mayor's office. Mm-hmm. And so we don't know whether or not there's any confidence in the police department right now that the FIU has changed practices. Have they gone back over some of these investigations and done them again? I don't know.
Well, I think there'll be some room to talk about this more in the future. Tony Messenger is a columnist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. You can find his recent investigative piece on the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department's audit of its force investigation unit. Tony, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski,
with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.